Hello, and welcome to the Surge Series, the official podcast of ISEIF, the Illinois Science and Energy Innovation Foundation. I'm your co-host, Clare Butterfield.
And I'm your co-host, Uzma Noormohamed.
ISEIF is a unique model in the energy world. We fund nonprofit organizations to educate people about energy and the smart grid. These organizations come together to work toward the same goals, to be trusted voices outside of the utility, to reach people in more personal ways, and to share what's working with each other. We call it a community of practice. We like to think of ourselves as addressing the human and community sides of energy and the electric grid, and that's what we showcase on this series.
If you like what you hear today, visit us at surgeseries.org to check out our past episodes and connect with us on Twitter. You can also subscribe to our mailing list. We're excited about today's show. Our guests are Steve Kihm of Madison think tank 7th Wave and Andy Satchwell of Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, both of whom work on economic models for utility companies.
We're interested here in how changing business models for utility companies will lead to a greater emphasis on community service or make that emphasis harder. But before we dive into the human-grid relationship, let's revisit a question we like on this podcast series, which is the animal-grid relationship.
The Chicago Tribune reported a couple days ago that a heat lamp for a snake tank in a home in the Chicago suburbs caught on fire, resulting in significant damage to the home. While we don't like stories in which the animals didn't survive, this one reports that the fire department did not know how many snakes were in the tank, but that none of them survived the fire.
So I just don't know how they can say something like that. If you don't know how many snakes were in there, you cannot have any idea whether any of them or all of them got away. We are seriously not making light of any human or snake misfortune here, but with the monkeys crashing the Kenyan power grid a few weeks ago, this story makes me wonder if the animals are getting together to use the electric grid against humans somehow.
Well, that would mean that the global non-human animal plot to disrupt human infrastructure spreads much farther than monkeys and squirrels into the reptile sector, and generally represents bad news for humans. I mean, you've seen the art house classic, Snakes on a Plane, right?
I have not seen that art house classic.
It's an art house classic. It had totally limited screenings. And by the way, we considered getting Samuel L. Jackson for a soundbite for today's episode. Then we thought, do we really want to be the Energy and Electric Grid podcast with an explicit rating from iTunes? Probably not.
Probably not.
But
one reason to like smart grid technology is that it allows for more renewable generation and distributed generation, which makes the energy mix greener and saves habitat, and we hope that mollifies the snakes so that they stop doing stuff like this.
Yeah, I mean, all I know is that without Samuel L. Jackson, good luck mollifying the snakes. Well, Steve and Andy, welcome.
Hey.
Thanks for having us.
We may not have built animal conspiracies into the economic... Steve and Andy, you may not have built animal conspiracies into your economic models, but can you give us an introduction into why, generally, utilities are looking at shifting their economic models? Can't they just keep building enormous power plants and recovering their costs from customers?
This is Steve, so maybe I'll jump in here first. Well, whether they can or can't is one question. Whether they should or shouldn't is another question. The basic model that utilities have operated under seems to be actually chugging along for them right now, but it's not clear how long that's going to last. If customer-cited options such as solar PV or even backup generators or energy efficiency or off-grid solutions continue to evolve, the utilities won't want to be building a lot more facilities because they'll potentially strand the assets. So we're in a dynamic position right now where we're just getting into the point where the markets are changing enough to be noticeable. So the utilities have an incentive, not just the utilities though, regulators, customers, everybody has an intellectual incentive, and for the utilities a financial incentive to look closely at what's happening.
Yeah, and I think from the perspective of when we think about utility profits and how electric utilities make money, I think of really two key issues that are at play. First, a dollar on the customer's bill is a dollar in utility revenues. And customer bills are a combination of energy sales, customer demand, and some fixed monthly customer fee. So these residential customer bills of today are mostly designed to collect the majority of revenues from that electricity sales component. So this makes investments that customers do in energy efficiency and rooftop solar, as Steve mentioned, more attractive to them because it can produce large bill savings for customers. But from the utility perspective, they're negatively impacted because those bill savings mean reduced revenues. And the second key issue is that electric utilities are largely motivated to build new assets. So these are things like new generating plants, new transmission lines, and upgraded or new distribution systems like the poles and wires. Things like energy efficiency and rooftop solar provide a benefit to customers in that they avoid these future new investments and reduce those utility costs. But because, again, the utility has this opportunity to make incremental profits on those future investments, the electric utility is negatively impacted, at least from a financial perspective. So this world of greater customer adoption of energy efficiency and demand response, customer-sided generation as well, the utility may experience a noticeable hit to their profits and future earnings.
The two of you in your writings and published work have used the expression the utility value engine. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Sure. This is Steve again. The value engine relates to this utility stock price. Stock price is a reflection of value, and stock prices don't just spring out of nowhere. They're actually driven by some key variables, which can be loosely termed risk, return, and scale, meaning the return is how much money you can make, risk is what's the uncertainty about the money you're going to make. You're going to make more or less than you expect, and then scale is simply the size of the investment. Those three things in concert work to drive the stock price. So it really is sort of a wealth engine, a value engine, and that's why we like to think of it that way, because just as like a gasoline internal combustion engine won't run with just gasoline alone, you have to have oxygen and other things have to go into the engine to make it run. Value can't be created without a combination of risk, return, and scale. So we sort of like the metaphor of it being an engine producing a value which then drives the stock price.
Yeah, and this is basically what powers the electric utility, their investments and their motivations. This value engine that we're talking about here is what powers investors to provide electric utilities with additional capital and sends signals to the electric utilities about whether they're creating or destroying that investor value.
So with less capital cycling through the value engine, what are some alternatives to traditional electric regulatory and business models to offset some of that lost value, and why are utilities hesitant to move towards those models?
Well, that's really an interesting question, because for 100 years or more, utilities have essentially sold electrons through wires. That's been their primary responsibility and goal. And now, as the opportunities on the customer side of the meter get more diverse, should the utility be providing services? Energy efficiency, for example, could be termed a service, helping customers use energy more wisely or more efficiently. But there also could be, it's potentially possible that the utilities could get into the full range of energy services, such as rooftop solar, backup generators, things like that. They could become a one-stop shop for all of your electric-related needs. Now, that actually raises some really interesting questions, some of which the regulator would weigh in on. In some cases, the regulator may not want the utility to branch out into those areas. Competitors don't especially like it. For example, let's say the utility is selling backup generators. Well, Home Depot sells backup generators. Home Depot may not like it that the utilities are selling them as well. So in terms of this idea of providing additional value by offering a wider range of services, it's an attractive idea to some, but others feel as though it's a threat to the development of the market. For example, in New York, where the New York Commission is looking at major utility reform, they have said they have precluded the utilities from doing what I just said. They're saying utilities cannot be providing these services. We want the market to provide that. So that sort of leaves the utility in a little bit of a bind. But this will be debated across the country, and I think we'll probably see different solutions in different jurisdictions.
Yeah, that's right. I agree with Steve that I think this is going to appear in different ways in different states based on those sort of particular circumstances for the utilities. And you know what Steve's talking about, this shift in profit achievement away from commodity sales, away from just selling more electricity towards profit achievement based on what service the utility provides. You know, you can extend that concept that might suggest electricity pricing based on the amount of cooling or heat that's provided, the amount of lighting perhaps that a utility provides to its customers. And so some of these are pretty fundamental shifts in both the roles that utilities play in the future. They may be limited perhaps in only offering a few services, and it also potentially increases or shifts some of the risks of future changes towards the utility in terms of either being able to accurately price services to make sure they reflect the true costs of providing them. There's been discussions around regulatory models with more explicit incentives to meet performance outcomes. This is something called performance-based regulation. It's actually quite common in other countries, most notably the UK, but pretty limited here in the US. And it's this regulatory model with these explicit incentives, but it poses a lot of new business risks for utilities operating in such an environment, largely around projecting future profitability. If their profits are tied to their ability to meet these sort of financial scorecard metrics as are being discussed in places like New York, you know, that's certainly an increased risk and a different operating environment for them in how they currently exist today.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just jump in here with one more point?
Yeah.
There are some, there's a spectrum of people who are looking at this not just from the utility perspective, but from the regulatory perspective. Some people are of the mind that regulation and utilities should only offer services that are what's known as a natural monopoly. Without getting too technical, we know that we don't want to have two sets of wires, two electric utilities providing service in a particular city. It would be inefficient, and it would be cumbersome to have these different sets of lines. And so we regulate one entity, we let it become a monopoly by state charter because it has a cost structure that lends itself to that. I had talked about a utility, for example, competing against Home Depot with backup generators. Well, there's no natural monopoly there. Mm-hmm. It's just two different entities. So some people believe that that's a clear violation of the basic idea of a regulated utility and should not be allowed. Other people believe, well, the market won't really flourish unless the utility jumpstarts it. So we have a lot of tension. This is a significant battle in a lot of places where people are trying to figure out just exactly what the role is of the utility. That's a different question from how can the utility make a lot of money. So one's a regulatory perspective, one's a financial perspective.
So just to build on that, because it leads to my next question, you know, here in Illinois, we are just doing our smart grid installations, and ComEd is, I think, one of the leading utilities trying to figure out what the future looks like. And they are doing some pilots of some home technologies, for example, just to make sure that they work with their systems, which makes sense. They would want to test them out and have them larger and larger test groups, but then at some point the market steps in and takes over. And there's perhaps a natural advantage of the utility having a certain level of trust from the customer over even maybe Best Buy or the 17-year-old in the aisle of Best Buy who's making a product recommendation. So how does this does really lead to the question of how the utility, the energy system of the future or the utility of the future becomes more participatory? Are consumers' behavior going to be more of a factor in the relationship between the utility and its consumer in the future? Does it help for consumers to be more engaged, or is it really better to just have good policies, set them, and forget them?
Yeah, that's a great follow-up question. I'm not sure that greater customer engagement and better regulation are opposing goals necessarily. I think that the two can come together. You know, to Steve's point, you know, we can't forget that utility management is largely motivated by financial objectives, right? They often, especially investor-owned utilities, have a fiduciary responsibility in that regard. And we've also at the same time seen this dramatic shift, as you noted, over the last 5 years or so in the number of customers who are really aware of their energy use and seeking investments to reduce that usage and potentially even self-generate. So obviously, as you lead to this greater interest among customers and greater need to meet a number of different customer sort of interests and energy use patterns, there's these emerging opportunities. And I think maybe the interesting question to ask is, how do regulators align some of those new opportunities that are emerging out of customer engagement and out of greater customer participation with that utility financial objective and with that utility financial incentive? Again, not an easy thing to do, right? And I think this is a question for regulators to mull over. You know, how do you set fair and reasonable rates that both encourage the adoption of energy efficiency and distributed energy, but at the same time, you know, create that financial opportunity for the utilities to stay involved and to help kind of build that grid around those future needs?
And I think we need to think about customers not as monolithic. One of the things that Andy and his colleague Pete Cappers and I talk about is utilities aren't monolithic in terms of their profit opportunities. We like to look at the specifics. But customers aren't monolithic either. Some customers would love to be engaged in the decision, would love to actually have solar PV on their home. Other customers would really just rather the utility sold them power through the meter and that's it. So when we have customer engagement, it's not going to be the whole customer base. It's likely to be, like in any marketing study, you've got the early adopters, and there's like all this segmentation of the market. So you would not be able to get some customers to engage even if you wanted them to, because they're just not interested. You'll have some people chomping at the bit to get in there. So that's just another thing that makes it a little complicated for the regulator and the utility, because their customers they're diverse, and no matter what they do, some customers are going to like it and some customers are not going to like it. So we've got sort of a dynamic problem here, and it's because we don't have just some simple, you know, puzzle pieces that we can put together. Here's the customer, here's the utility, here's the regulator. Oh, a nice little puzzle. We've got millions of people and different financial situations for utilities, different regulatory, even different legislation in some states. Like in Illinois, the return on equity, which is one of the key variables that Andy and Pete and I look at, is set by law. So some things are taken off the table. And so the idea, I'm always nervous when we talk about consumers and utilities, because back to my earlier statement, that we will have I think more of a patchwork quilt solution than a nice uniform smooth silk sheet covering the country. It'll be quite a quilt.
Well, from a regulatory standpoint, can you talk to us a little bit about the decarbonization efforts that are going on in New York, in Illinois, and in California? There are some big long-term visionary plans that are just at the very beginning of being rolled out. And one of us used to be a lawyer, and the other one never did. So please speak slowly.
Sure. So yeah, New York, Illinois, and California, these are considered maybe what we'd call leading edge states in terms of their acceleration of renewable energy goals, energy efficiency programs, and in particular reforms to utility regulatory and business models. And to Steve's point, the approaches are different and unique to each state. So for example, New York is implementing changes to the utility's role and creating more explicit performance incentive mechanisms. The New York, what's called Reforming the Energy Vision, or REV proceeding, envisions this model where the utility maintains and operates a distribution system platform that enables third-party service providers, whether they're providing energy efficiency services, whether they're installing and bringing solar onto the grid to meet customer energy needs. They would sort of participate on top of this distribution system platform. And New York's also implementing financial and non-financial scorecard measurements to track progress of the utilities, largely in meeting public policy goals and the outcomes that they're interested in. Now, so that's New York. California is tackling several important issues at once in several different proceedings. Notably, the state is considering targeted financial incentive mechanisms for utilities for distributed generation in locations where it can provide the greatest operational benefit for customers. So say on a very constrained distribution feeder, if you can reduce the sort of load on that distribution feeder, you can provide a great amount of benefit, often at a lower cost than if you had to sort of build new infrastructure like substations or distribution equipment. And what they're doing is really harnessing the power of the value engine we've been talking about to align utility financial interests with third-party investments in distributed generation. And Illinois, at the same time, as well as exploring several issues, among them customer data access, that actually I think may be a key to unlocking greater customer energy awareness and furthering that adoption of efficiency and other technologies. So I think it's important to observe the range of issues being discussed. It suggests how complicated this transition is going to be, the diversity of approaches among states, and also the time dimension, that these issues won't be settled overnight. I think the work that Steve and I and our colleague Pete Kappers are really trying to do is to provide an objective analysis that really assists regulators and policymakers in these longer-term discussions and deliberations.
And let me just pick up on what Andy was saying and talk about California specifically. So Seventh Wave and Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, a commissioner invited us to come out and talk, to lead a workshop on the issue of incentives for utilities. We always have to remember, because this became clear in terms of the audience participation, that the most profitable path for the utility may or may not be the best path for society or for consumers. And we should never pretend that our financial analysis, which I think is a very deep dive, and Andy, you can chime in here if you agree with me, but we're diving deep rather than broad. We're looking at one issue, which is, we're focusing on one issue, which is how can utilities be made profitable at the same time as they're implementing cleaner resources that customers want. But that doesn't answer all of the questions. It doesn't answer what is the most cost-effective route. So there are all these ancillary issues, they're not really ancillary issues, they're competing issues. And so we have to always be careful that our work isn't misinterpreted, because some people will say, well, you're suggesting utilities, that the regulator should just make sure that the utility maximizes its stock price. That's not at all what we're doing. We're trying to find ways in which there can be solutions that not only benefit customers, but benefit the utility investor as well. There certainly are solutions that benefit customers, but not the utility. There's other resource choices that will benefit the utility, not the customer. We're trying to actually provide this detailed analysis on the investor side so that when you come to the table with the customer side and the environmental side, you have all the pieces. The thing that's been often missing is the financial side has been often kind of a hand wave as opposed to actually the kind of detailed analysis that we're doing. So we're trying to contribute to the debate in that way, but again, you should never take any of our work as saying, well, here's the answer, because it's always just a contributing piece, not the overall story.
So if I can just reflect back what I think we've heard up to this point, and even though I am the one who used to be a lawyer, I'm going to try to do this slowly. We want the utility to be profitable because it has a monopoly on an essential service that drives electricity into our homes. We also want to develop the third-party marketplace of suppliers of, say, renewable generation and other services that may use the data streams that are coming off the smart meters and lots of new products that are coming into the marketplace. And consumers may, time will tell, may be increasingly interested in getting more involved in their energy use, paying attention to those data streams, taking advantage of the products that let them do so. So that's the fix we're in, and your deep dive helps us not ignore that monopoly utility needs to continue to be profitable or stuff starts blowing up on the system. And so how do regulators best support electric utilities, consumers, and those third parties in the marketplace?
Boy, that's a tough question. I'll take a stab at it, but Steve, certainly please weigh in as well. You know, I think regulators are being asked to evaluate really complex issues right now. I think there's, as to Steve's earlier point, you know, their primary objective is not to maximize the utility stock price, and they have to weigh a difficult balance between maintaining a certain level of financial viability for the electric utility and at the same time properly and reasonably allocating risks and costs to customers as well. and not sort of unfairly passing the risks and costs of the future onto customers. And so this is a delicate balancing act that they have to undertake. You know, I think there's definitely some jurisdictions, again, New York, Minnesota is one of them as well. Minnesota in particular has a stakeholder-driven process right now where they have the utility and advocates, both consumer advocates and environmental advocates, at the table discussing transition strategies towards this future regulatory and business model for the utility. And so the more parties that get involved and the more sort of objective and unbiased analysis that can be brought into those proceedings, I really think helps arm those regulators with the different perspectives, with some of the compromise solutions and some of the analysis to really help them grapple with that balancing act. But it's difficult, and there's no optimal solution for sure.
And I wanted to weigh in on the idea of profits and utilities. That, like all of these issues, has many layers. One is the United States Supreme Court has told regulators that there are certain standards that they must meet. They must allow utilities a reasonable opportunity to earn a fair return. So regardless of what's happening, the regulator has that initial constraint. That's not a stock price maximization objective, but it's certainly a threshold level that they have to meet. And absent some really cataclysmic circumstances, the regulator is bound to help the utility recover its costs and earn a reasonable return on those. But the reason that's so important in a transition market is utilities have ready access to capital. If you need if Pacific Gas and Electric, for example, needs $1 billion, it can actually get it in fairly short order and pay a reasonable rate on, let's say, a bond issue. It's ready to go. It can move capital around quickly. We've seen the non-utility third parties like SolarCity, NRG, SunEdison have difficulty in the financial markets. They're not as strong. They're newcomers. It will take them perhaps longer to unfold some of these things. So it gets back to this issue of the utility is an established player with ready access to capital. The third parties are more fledgling, and market innovators would say, well, they'll be more creative over the long run. That may be true. But we've got this dynamic tension. Right now, if you look at the markets, utility stocks have gone up a lot in the last couple of years, and the third-party stocks of third-party entities have gone down a lot. Investors are sort of reconfiguring and thinking, well, maybe I'll just stick with the utility and move away from these other. We know that Tesla wants to buy SolarCity, so there's movement in that whole market. But that's you don't say, am I going to buy Pacific Gas Electric or am I going to buy NRG or SolarCity? They're not substitutes. They're very different kinds of organizations. And if you need to move things along or at least provide a catalyst to get going, the utilities have the access to kind of argue that that's necessarily the right answer. It's just a fact that they can get capital quite easily and quite quickly. And so some regulators see the utility as playing that key role, especially in a transition. Maybe that'll go away as these other entities become more established. I mean, these are not NRG and SolarCity and SunEdison aren't tiny companies. They're big sluggers, but it's just been more difficult for them to play that financial game. So the question is, will the market step up with enough resources, or do we need the utility in the transition to raise the capital as well? And if you don't let the utilities earn a reasonable return on their investments, the utility's not going to want to step to the plate and provide the capital. So it's a give and take with the investor, the regulator, and then the third parties. All in everything we've said today is there's always a complicated answer to everything.
Well, we're at a time where utilities are doing some soul searching, and the shift to clean energy is prompting them to find different sources of revenue. And so what are some of the new opportunities that you're seeing for utilities to serve customers as new markets emerge that might give them that return on investment?
I think we've seen utilities beginning to invest in companies that install solar. Duke Progress now actually has made several investments in solar companies. Some utilities are investing in energy storage, which is definitely an emerging technology. AES Corp in particular has made some of those strategic investments. And even other utilities are on the leading edge of making investments in microgrids. And this is an example of what I believe Steve was talking about, which is them leveraging their capital, which is often at a lower cost of capital relative to other companies, leveraging that capital to make strategic investments in a modernized grid. I think the next opportunity is going to be for them to link these investments with their own electric grids and with their own networks to really harness the benefits for customers.
And let me just talk about the microgrid issue that Andy raised, because this is really a good example of how things get kind of dicey. So utilities, a microgrid is essentially a small utility system that sits, might be on a college campus or something, that actually can island. By that, what we mean is it actually can disconnect from the main grid and continue to run, so there'll be a generation source and substations, and it's a mini little utility. But typically they're connected to the utility because then they can buy and sell power, and they can generate when it's cheaper for them to generate, and they can buy when it's cheaper to buy from the utility. But in extreme situations, in Hurricane Sandy or Superstorm Sandy, Princeton was on Princeton University was on a microgrid, and the city of Princeton lost power for like 2 weeks, and Princeton University stayed lit. And so that's actually a microgrid, sort of an interesting play. Well, the utilities would say, well, why don't you just let us own it as an extension of our system, and you can still operate it and island it if you want to, but we'll own the assets, because utilities make money actually on the assets. But here's where the third-party developers have stepped up and said, absolutely not. This is our game, and you're going to take away our financial opportunity. We want to own those microgrids. The utilities will pick off the big ones. It's usually campuses or hospitals or things like that, and they'll leave nothing for us. So this is the point of dynamic tension. It's like, if we want microgrids, should we let the third parties provide them, or should we let utilities provide them? I know that the question was about what utilities are doing, but every time you walk into a new service, you're likely to get a pushback from a third party saying, that is not a monopoly service, that does not need to be under the rubric of a regulated utility. And so every time that issue has to be addressed, and it can, like in New York, as I said, the New York Commission has said, well, we're not going to let the utilities play in that market. In other places, utilities may be encouraged or on their own motion are going in that direction. Back to my patchwork quilt of a solution, I think we'll see different ways that this will play out across the country.
Well, that brings us to our last question of one other asset that the utilities have control over for the moment, which is the data stream that is increasingly important, and we probably I don't think we understand yet how important it is, because I don't think that the applications that are really exciting to consumers have been invented yet. But what is your philosophy about the data stream? Who owns it? And if the customer owns their own data, does it matter if they know what to do with it? And what are you recommending that regulators assure that customers have in order to do data?
So I would say that I certainly don't have a set philosophy on customer data ownership and access necessarily, but I think your question raises an important point. Much of what we've discussed today is really about the utility not simply making more investments, but rather about the utility making smarter investments. And customer electricity consumption information, daily usage patterns, linkages to appliances, and understanding energy behavior in the home are a key piece of identifying the smarter investments and really maximizing the benefits. That said, there are some real concerns about data privacy, and it's, I think, smart for regulators to explore customer data issues as part of a comprehensive transition strategy. And it may even make sense for utility regulators to take lessons from other data-intensive industries with privacy as a concern. Things like healthcare. Obviously, that's a place where there's significant customer information, where customer privacy is a key concern, and there may be some lessons there around data access that could be leveraged for the electric industry.
And I think also the industry, if we think about the history of the utility industry, it's been electrons flowing one way, and any information gathered was for the utility to operate its system more efficiently. The customer was really sort of just on the other end of the meter, turning lights and televisions on and off and computers on and off, and that was the extent of it. So the whole culture of a utility is about their system. They would consider that more their data than customers' data, because they're using that information to adjust voltages and things of that nature. When the customers start getting engaged, as we had talked about earlier, some of them want to get engaged. Just culturally, the utilities are not accustomed to having millions of people coming back to them and in saying, I'm going to use my data to do this, and I want you to develop services that allow me to shed load, and so now instead of having these nodes on the distribution system that might be 10,000 nodes, they have 1 million customers who can do all sorts of things. And if you've ever worked in an organization where information flowed one way and all of a sudden the river started flowing the other way, so just that from a human relations point of view, the utilities are not really set up to deal with the masses, and so that raises a really interesting question. The utilities probably are not going to be the innovators in that area, because it runs counter, and I'm not trying to say that they're doing anything untoward. Their systems just work in one direction. This goes the other way. So that innovation is more likely to come from third parties. So that's an example where the third parties may have an advantage over the utilities, because they're not constrained in their thinking about flows in one direction. They want the information and the power, actually, in some cases, to flow in the opposite direction. So there would be maybe a case where you'd really want to encourage the third party development, because I think they're going to be able to be more innovative in that respect.
Well, that's all the time that we have for today. Thanks again, Steve and Andy, for joining us.
Thanks for having us. This has been great.
Yes, thank you.
If you like what you've heard today, visit us at searchseries.org and check out our past episodes, or check out iTunes, where we are now the #1 downloaded podcast in the non-human animal electric grid encounters category. Actually, we're not, but you can rate us there and let us know how much you like us. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.